Welcome back. Racial disparities that seem to exist along socioeconomic lines, it's pretty hard to debate it. It's there. The average household incomes of whites more than 50% larger than that of African Americans. On the education front, a third of blacks have a two-year degree, but nearly half of all whites have one. Blacks, they top the list when it comes to single-parent households. Two-thirds of African American homes are run by a single parent compared to about a quarter of whites. And the Pew Research Center reports that in 2010, black men more than 6 times more likely, as white men to be incarcerated. Well, first let's start on the justice front, because one of the debates going on right now, and we talked about the Attorney General nominee, and his position on this is sentencing and sentencing guidelines, specifically as it relates to drugs. There was some debate that how do you treat coke and crack, depending on the communities, one both equally bad, you can argue. At one point, crack was sentenced 100 times harsher than that of cocaine. Heroin now is in communities of all different colors, of suburban, rural, urban areas, and now there's a huge compassion, I think, to this to treat it more as an illness than a vice. Nonetheless, how dangerous is it if we reverse the trend we seem to be on for treatment to go back to incarceration with a huge portion of what makes up the prison population of nonviolent offenders and drugs?
I think it is very dangerous. But I think the question comes out, and this is the question that you would have for the new Attorney General of the Department of Justice, is that in the 80s we went through the crack epidemic, and when by and large African Americans were using that drug. And the only option, and I came out of the Clinton administration, was to jail them. There was no care, there was no treatment, jail. And what you do is you can disseminate people for generations and decades to come. Now that the growing number of narcotics used in this country is heroin, and it's not being used by people like us, and all of a sudden now police officers throughout the country are armed with a drug to bring them back. And people look at it and say, well, what is the difference here? And then if you counter it with, and the New York Times did an article about a month ago about people in jail, black and white, that were up for parole. Similar, records, and found that the African Americans were spending an extra 32 months before they came eligible for parole. You cannot deny the racism and the bias that takes place in the criminal justice system. And when we just want to just skirt over it, what you do is that you're going to have African Americans continue to be at the bottom of the totem pole, and then the question is going to become, well, it's your fault because you didn't do it. And I just think it's important to bring out that there's a lot of things, and we can talk for hours on that, what the African American community needs to do independently to withhold themselves. But do not deny the fact that there are things that's taking place in government or not taking place in government that support the suppression that has been taking place for a very long period of time. And that's why we want to make sure that the people who are in this particular position are not in a state of deniability to what's happening.
2 quick points on the criminal justice. First, as mentioned earlier, African Americans need to balance their politics, because under the Clinton administration, the Democratic administration, more African Americans went to jail because of the crime bill than at any point in time in this country. And so one thing that has been going down and decreasing, all these categories, economic, health, education, have increased in the past 20 years, even though they're still not where they should be. But one thing that has gone downwards is incarceration of people of color. Second point, and we have to deal with mandatory minimums. That's what we're talking about. The federal government and state governments have mandatory minimums basically dealing with drugs. Secondly, we need to move back to rehabilitation. It's been almost 40 years where we used to talk about rehabilitation. Somebody comes out of jail, they have education, some job skills. Now we're just moving to our incarceration. So we have to get back, and I hope this president
just if I could step on that, forget your politics, forget if you're hard on crime, whatever it is the cheapest and best investment, because they're going to get out. And you don't want to stick in the guys that's going to cost you a lot more to house them every single year. Yep. We've done a lot on this program on it. Has nothing to do with politics. This has to do with basic math. In terms of, we talk about this every year, accountability within the community. I've seen out-of-wedlock births go up across every ethnic and racial line that there is. This is not just a black problem, but when you look at 18 to 22-year-old black men, the likelihood of them being at some level of the criminal justice system, whether it be awaiting trial, in prison, on parole, it is mind-blowing. And then the amount of children that grow up without a father figure in the community, also staggering. At what point does it become a community that looks at it as their own crisis, as well as more, these are the contributing factors that led us to here?
George Karl, NBA coach, just wrote a book. And in his book, there was a section where he talked about some of the players that he has coached. And with those players, he referenced that they would have been better off if there had been a father in the home.
They didn't appreciate that, by the
No,
way.
they didn't appreciate that at all. But that doesn't mean that he's wrong.
Right.
The goal isn't just to simply have a man in the house. It's to have a good man in the house. And so the counter argument is that sometimes it's better not to have a man if that man is not contributing constructively to that home, to the development of those children, to the well-being of that woman. And so, again, what I'm saying in the short version is, yes, it's good to have a good man in the house, and I believe that that can have a positive effect on our community.
Reverend Richard Felt, we could talk about this stuff for an hour. I'm limited on time, but thank you very much for joining us on what is always a very important day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, everyone, one of the most famous and influential speeches in American history. Of course, I'm talking about the I Have a Dream speech. We'll have that for you next.